The dust settled thick on her worn boots, coating the rough fabric of her dress like a shroud. The sun beat down on the wide, unforgiving land, and the air tasted of grit and dry grass. Sarah stood before him, a small, trembling figure silhouetted against the vast emptiness of the prairie. He was a man carved from the landscape itself, tall, broad-shouldered, his face weathered and unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. This was Josiah Thorne, owner of more land than her eyes could encompass, a man who spoke little and whose presence commanded a silence that felt both intimidating and absolute. She had sought him out at the edge of his property, far from the main ranch house, praying for the privacy this isolation offered. But privacy did little to quiet the frantic pounding in her chest. Her hands twisted a thin piece of cloth, her knuckles white. The words felt like stones in her throat, heavy with fear and desperation. She looked up, meeting his gaze, and saw nothing there but a still, watchful quiet that mirrored the land around them. Summoning a breath that felt inadequate for the task, she finally whispered, the sound barely audible above the rustle of dry weeds, "It's your baby, sir." The stillness in Josiah Thorne deepened, becoming absolute. He didn't flinch, didn't curse, didn't recoil. He simply froze, his eyes, the color of a storm-swept sky, fixed on her face. The fear she saw reflected there was her own, amplified by the terrifying blankness of his expression. Time seemed to stretch and warp, measured only by the frantic beat of her own heart. The sun felt hotter, the dust thicker, the silence louder. Every breath she took was a fragile thing, held captive by the weight of the unspoken. This was the moment her life would splinter, scattering into fragments of shame and solitude, or perhaps, impossibly, find a different, albeit difficult, path. She had pictured this moment 1,000 times, each imagining a different, equally terrible outcome. Scorn, denial, outright cruelty. But the absence of any immediate reaction was perhaps the most terrifying of all. It was an unknown, a void into which her precarious future might vanish entirely. Finally, after an eternity measured in held breaths and pounding blood, he moved. It was a small movement, a slight shift of his weight, but it broke the spell. His gaze remained steady, piercing. He didn't ask questions. He didn't offer comfort or accusation. His voice, when it came, was low, rough, and devoid of discernible emotion, much like the grinding of stone. "You'll come with me," he said, and the words were not a request, but a simple statement of fact as immutable as the horizon. He turned, not waiting for her response, and walked towards a sturdy, dust-coated wagon hitched nearby. Sarah stared after him, her mind reeling. It wasn't the outcome she had feared the most, but neither was it hope. It was merely a path forward, dictated by him into the unknown. With shaking legs, she gathered the small, pathetic bundle of her belongings and followed. The silence between them stretched on, heavy and unbroken, a forecast of the journey ahead. The vast, indifferent sky seemed to watch their small procession as they moved deeper into the unforgiving heart of his territory, leaving the last vestiges of her old, tenuous life behind in the settling dust. Her fear remained, a cold knot in her stomach, but alongside it, a sliver of something else began to stir, the fierce, quiet determination of a woman facing the unavoidable, her only option to walk into the storm and see if she could find shelter within its eye. He took her not to the sprawling main house, where the windows would be eyes and the walls would whisper, but to a smaller, isolated cabin nestled in a protective fold of the land, miles from the nearest neighbor. It was sturdy, built of rough-hewn logs, designed to withstand the wind and the seasons, yet inside it was starkly bare. A rough bed frame, a small table, a single chair, a cast-iron stove. Essentials and nothing more. It mirrored his own sparse way of life, she suspected, and perhaps his view of her needs, purely functional. He left her there with a sack of flour, some dried meat, beans, and a heavy wool blanket. His instructions were minimal, delivered in that same quiet, toneless voice. "There's a well yonder. Keep the fire stoked." He didn't ask about her, didn't offer help beyond the basic provisions for survival. It was a transaction, a form of responsibility acknowledged through practical, unfeeling action. He was providing shelter and sustenance, nothing more. The silence returned after he left, a physical weight in the small cabin. It pressed in on her, magnifying the solitude and the gnawing fear. She was alone, truly alone, in the vast, empty land, dependent on the silent, unreadable man who was the father of her child. Days blurred into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the necessities of survival. She hauled water from the well, the bucket heavy in her weakening hands. She gathered sparse firewood, learning to read the land for deadfall. She cooked the simple provisions, the smell of wood smoke and boiling beans her only company. Her body ached, and the constant nausea was a bitter reminder of the life growing within her. She felt like a trespasser, a secret tucked away from the world, a problem to be contained. There was no kindness in his actions, no softness in his gaze when he appeared every few weeks, always unannounced. He would ride up, check the provisions, observe her for a long moment with those intense, assessing eyes, and then ride away. He never spoke of the child. He never spoke of her past or his own. Their interactions were purely functional transactions of need and provision. Yet, in his silent observation, she began to sense something beyond mere calculation. A watchfulness, perhaps, a quiet assessment of her resilience. He wasn't cruel, not in the ways she had feared. He was simply distant, contained. Like the land, he gave only what was necessary for life, expecting nothing in return but endurance. She learned to live with the silence, to find strength in the small, arduous tasks. The fear remained, a constant companion, but it began to harden into something else, a fierce protectiveness for the life inside her. This child was hers, would be entirely dependent on her, and that knowledge fueled a quiet determination she hadn't known she possessed. The cabin, initially a symbol of her isolation, began to feel like a refuge, a small, sturdy world she was building for two. She patched cracks in the logs, chinked against the coming cold, scrubbed the floor clean. These acts were small rebellions against the despair, affirmations of her own agency. She didn't ask him for more. She didn't complain. She simply endured, and in that endurance, she began to find a quiet dignity. The land outside was still vast and unforgiving, but she was no longer a trembling figure lost in its immensity. She was a woman preparing to face the coming winter, and the coming life, alone if necessary, but not without a fight. The silence between her and the land, and between her and Josiah Thorne, remained. But now, within that silence, there was the faint, rising hum of her own quiet strength. As autumn bled into the harsh bite of early winter, the demands intensified. The wind howled around the cabin, finding every crevice, and the cold seeped deep into the bones. Her body, heavy now with the growing child, protested the labor, but the need was absolute. The firewood pile dwindled quickly in the relentless cold. The well was a treacherous trek through swirling snow. It was during one of these increasingly difficult excursions for wood that she saw him again, riding towards the cabin through the gray, weighted air. This time he was not alone. A second rider followed, a man she vaguely recognized from the distant town, his face sharp and unwelcome. As they approached, she felt a familiar wave of dread. This man embodied the judgment she had fled, the prying eyes and wagging tongues. He dismounted with an air of self-importance, his gaze sweeping over her with open contempt before settling on the cabin. "Here tell you've taken in strays, Thorne," he sneered, his voice carrying on the wind. "Might cause complications down the line. Claims. Best to clean things up." Josiah dismounted slowly, his movements economical, his face as unreadable as ever. He didn't raise his voice, didn't make a grand gesture. He simply stood between Sarah and the other man, a silent, immovable barrier. "She's under my protection, Miller," Josiah said, his voice low but carrying an absolute finality that cut through the wind's howl. "Anything you got to say, you say to me," Miller scoffed, shifting his weight, but his eyes flickered with uncertainty as they met Thorne's steady, unwavering gaze. There was no threat in Thorn's stance, no outward display of aggression, but the sheer, quiet power radiating from him was undeniable. It was the power of a man utterly rooted in his land, in his authority, a man who did not need to shout to be obeyed. The air crackled with unspoken tension. Sarah watched, a fragile hope blossoming in her chest. He wasn't just providing shelter, he was providing a shield. He was standing against the world for her and for the child. Miller hesitated, clearly weighing the risk of challenging Thorn. The silence stretched, filled only by the whine of the wind. Finally, with a grudging sneer, Miller remounted his horse. "Just friendly advice, Thorn," he muttered, pulling at the reins. "Wouldn't want things getting messy." He rode away without another look at Sarah, disappearing back into the swirling snow. Josiah watched him go, then turned back to Sarah. He didn't speak of what had happened. He simply looked at the small pile of wood she had managed to gather. Without a word, he walked over, picked up the axe, and began to chop, the steady thud of the blade against wood the only sound in the suddenly quieter air. Sarah watched him, the fear finally beginning to recede, replaced by a profound, unexpected sense of belonging. The protection wasn't just against the elements or the judgment of men like Miller. It was a space being carved out in the harshness, a place where she was no longer adrift. He chopped wood until dusk, creating a pile that would last for weeks. He checked the well, tested the chimney draft. Practical, necessary actions, devoid of fanfare. As darkness fell, he didn't leave immediately as he usually did. He stepped inside the cabin. The space felt smaller with his large presence, but no longer isolating. He sat at the small table, silent. Sarah made coffee, the rich aroma filling the cabin. She poured him a mug, her hands steadier now, and placed it before him. He looked at her, his gaze soft for the first time she had ever seen. It was not love, perhaps not even affection, but recognition. Of her resilience, her quiet strength, the shared battle against the elements and the world. He didn't speak of the future, or the baby, or their unlikely path. He didn't need to. The silence between them was no longer empty, but filled with a quiet understanding, a shared resilience forged in hardship. She had come to him a frightened, vulnerable woman whispering a terrifying truth. Now, she stood in her small, sturdy cabin, preparing for a new life, no longer alone. The harsh land outside remained, but they would face it together, two solitary figures finding unexpected strength in their quiet, unlikely partnership against the vast, indifferent world. The coming child would be born not into shame and solitude, but into a place carved out by necessity and defended by quiet strength, a testament to endurance and the possibility of finding light even in the deepest shadow.